Welcome to the Dogtor Bros, where we have an honest discussion around vet life in and out of the clinic. My name is Jeff. I'm your doc of the day and your guide through this episode. I'm a dermatology associate veterinarian living in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm here with my closest friends from vet school.
Hey, this is Chris. I'm a GP in North Carolina.
Hey, this is Brandon. I'm a internal medicine associate veterinarian in Colorado.
And this is Adam. I'm a relief veterinarian in Louisville, Kentucky.
All right, and this is Jeff again. And right at the top, I'll mention this is going to be a part 2 to our vaccines episode. So if you haven't listened to that one, I encourage you to pause this, go and listen to part 1, the one about vaccines. We covered questions like what are considered core vaccines, general news on vaccines. We talked about how to approach owners if they're skeptical about vaccines, and how we treat certain vaccine reactions. So we'll kind of take off from there in just a moment. But like always, we'll start off with a little bit of a fun question. So, bros, what was your favorite cartoon as a kid?
This is Brandon. I have two that are hard to choose between, but I think I'll pick one over the two. The two of them are Pokemon, which I loved growing up.
Yes.
And then Dragon Ball Z, which I loved watching growing up as well. I think when push comes to shove, I'd probably pick Dragon Ball Z over all of them. It was just such a good show.
You know, that's fair. That's fair. This is Jeff. I'll say Pokemon is also one of my absolute favorites. Still has a special place in my heart. And I like Digimon a lot too, honestly. And some of those other Cartoon Network ones were pretty good, but I'd say Pokemon and Digimon always fight for favorite in my heart.
This is Chris. I'm conflicted with two, but I think the one I want to pick is Rocket Power.
Ooh, good choice.
Oh,
That's a good one.
That's a good one. That is a good one.
And then Avatar was pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Last Airbender?
Last Airbender, yeah.
Last Airbender.
Avatar? Yeah. I guess that's the only one that's a cartoon, but yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good show.
That's a solid choice.
This is Adam. I don't remember watching. I guess I didn't watch a lot of cartoons as a kid. I guess I was more into like Disney movies and that sort of thing. I would say, just thinking of like cartoons when I was real little, like the Magic School Bus is one that comes to mind. And then I have like a Rocket Power is one that was a good one. I will say that. I had totally forgotten about Rocket Power, but that was good. But also Gargoyles. What was that on? I don't even remember.
Disney. That's a good one.
Disney.
But I do remember Gargoyles. That was a pretty sweet one too.
So it's a very good, all honestly excellent answers. Very nostalgic. I love it here. So we're gonna proceed as if you have listened to part 1 already. So again, go back and check that episode if you haven't yet. But diving a little bit more into some things we haven't covered on vaccines in general, I would love, and this is a little bit of treating our GPs as our specialists here, I feel like, or our experts in this field, since Brandon and I don't do as many vaccines. But I would love to hear from Chris and Adam, y'all in particular, on what are your thoughts for vaccines for older patients? Like do you have a cutoff? Is it just all the way until the end? And how do you approach that?
So this is Adam. I'll jump in here. So for the most part, I recommend those core vaccines that we touched on for all patients, including older patients. You do, obviously, as they get very old and very later in life, and they start to develop other conditions like heart disease or kidney disease or diabetes or other advanced stage diseases, you need to have some of those realistic conversations with owners of, what we want to do for their patients and what's best for their patients. Typically, if they're definitely towards later stage of life, and we're talking more palliative care, I will have that kind of open discussion with the owner. And there have been times that we've agreed to, okay, let's just do the rabies for this patient. not to overwhelm the system or overwhelm the immune system. There's a lot of other things going on in the body. But again, that's kind of reserved for those kind of end-of-life type patients. They can be 16, 17 years old, but as long as they're otherwise doing good at home, I mean, let's go ahead and vaccinate them. I mean, even if they're not boarding or grooming or things like that, they're still coming out to come to the clinic. We obviously do a good job of keeping things clean and as sterile as possible, and as, mitigate disease as much as possible in the clinic, but things spread. We do have sick patients there. So we still want to keep those patients protected. So if they're otherwise healthy, I'm still recommending those core vaccines. But again, some of those later stage end of life type patients, we may have that conversation to maybe just do a rabies vaccine.
And this is Chris. I mean, I pretty much do it the same way Adam does it. Quality of life, end of stage life things, we'll just talk about just doing rabies and what's required by law. But for the most part, I don't really have any difference in how Adam does it versus how I do it.
What are y'all's thoughts on if a client asks you about titers? Like, is it based on like local laws, or what does that look like in clinic for y'all?
This is Adam. I have had some rare instances where clients have asked about titers. Clients that, want to mitigate the amount of vaccines that their patient receives. As far as I am aware, I believe this is on a state-by-state basis. Kentucky does not approve rabies vaccination status based on titers. It has to be either a 1-year rabies vaccine or a 3-year rabies vaccine after a 1-year rabies vaccine administered by a licensed veterinarian. They can take a titer test. It can show that they have an appropriate response. But as far as Kentucky goes, they're not going to count that. They have to have that vaccination. Again, to my knowledge, or as far as I'm aware, that is on a state-by-state basis. So, again, if clients want to do that titer testing, I'm more than happy to do that for them. But, again, it's just having that conversation with them of, this isn't going to, protect you in terms of the requirement by the law. They really do need that annual or every 3-year rabies vaccination.
This is Chris. Yeah, we pretty much do the same thing. And I've had clients that want titers for the DHPP vaccines and other vaccines, and we'll do it for them. And that's not a problem for us to do it. And then we just notated in the records about that. And then same with rabies. That's a state law, so we don't really change anything there. We just do how that one is by the book. But for titers, I'm not against it. Titers, some people ask about doing titers, and it usually is way more expensive than just doing the vaccine. So a lot of people want to hear about the titer cost. So it's like, just do the vaccine because it's cheaper. But that's kind of how it's handled with us here. And it's not anything, I'm not against titers. It's usually more of it's a cost effective thing. So we'll end up just vaccinating them instead of, if that's the issue with the owners.
This is Brandon. Yeah, as far as like Colorado law is concerned, like just at least for the rabies vaccine, that's like required for dogs and cats. So titers are technically not an acceptable form of showing proof of like adequate immunity in a patient. I know that certain, I'd have to look it up because I don't remember, but certain like health certificates for travel require rabies titers. Into certain countries, if I remember correctly. So that is like one instance where like I just remember doing rabies titers for a dog or a cat. And then, this is something that we'll probably touch on here shortly, but depending on a patient's like safety as far as giving vaccines or not giving vaccines for a specific reason, that would be an indication to do the titers. So we can probably jump into this now, but like for a patient that has some sort of immune-mediated disease, whether that be a dermatologic disease or something like immune-mediated hemolytic anemia or immune-mediated thrombocytopenia that I would be dealing with, which is like essentially immune-mediated disease causing destruction of the red blood cells or the platelets, respectively. Those patients, giving them a vaccine is probably not going to be very effective in mounting a immune response and protection because they're on drugs that suppress the immune system. So in those patients, if they truly need to show proof of protection, then titers would be the best way to do that for that patient specifically.
And Brandon, follow-up question for you on that then. Do you ever worry that certain vaccines are going to trigger autoimmune diseases that you see in internal medicine?
Yeah, that's the big debate. We don't really know. That's the way I see it. There's a lot of different statements out there that are like consensus statements from the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine. There's a immune-mediated hemolytic anemia one. There's a ITP one that just came out this past year. And they both make a statement about vaccination. The thought is that vaccination could trigger like a recurrent immune response and trigger that previous immune response that resulted in the destruction of those red blood cells or platelets. So generally speaking, we don't recommend vaccination because there's enough concern with like the theory out there that yes, it could cause a recurrence, but I don't think there's any hard evidence to support that. So I usually tell clients ideally you don't vaccinate your pet, or at least only get the core vaccine, understanding that there's a risk of recurrence of the disease, but at the same time, there's no hard evidence that that's going to happen. And then I kind of leave it in the owner's court with that information at that point.
This is Jeff again, and I'd kind of want to piggyback on that and kind of mention, because we deal with the same kind of things in dermatology land, as far as there's reports out there kind of mentioning, yes, some vaccines may be triggers to some of our autoimmune diseases. There are technically some reports, some convincing reports, I'll say, where nothing else was changed in a patient and they had a vaccine, and then they did end up with something like pemphigus, or I mentioned cutaneous adverse vaccine reactions, which is a mouthful, in regards to some rabies patients causing specifically some hair loss on the right rear end. And there are some more widespread conditions that can potentially affect all of the skin, like all over, that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And I'm very, very overall very pro vaccines for most patients. So for the most part, it would have to be super individualized, because I'm talking about an extremely rare type of condition where we maybe have like one or two very convincing reports. But as you mentioned, Brandon, it's very hard to nail that type of information down. Now that I've done a research project and read an absurd amount of scientific literature in residency, I can say the hardest part about it is if there's suspicion for vaccines causing a reaction, it's hard. You don't necessarily want to give it again if you think you're going to cause the same reaction. So even when like we mentioned in the last episode, doing pre-meds, it's quote unquote, as far as like doing a study, when we're talking about how we're supposed to do no harm with our veterinary oath, you can't really give it again if you think it's actively causing a problem, with the exception being if I'm actively like pre-medding and using things that we have a little bit of literature, like when we're giving diphenhydramine or steroids in advance, that's protective. And so in that case, we are actively trying to do no harm and protect our patients. But if I think a vaccine caused an autoimmune condition, then I kind of do like you do, Brandon. And I'm like, well, perhaps we should not give it again. And then you consider titers. And then you're still left in that scenario of like, my understanding as well was it's probably not legally protective, even if you recommend not having them given again, but they just have to decide, and I recommend obviously referencing local law too, and the lifestyle of the patient to kind of decide what to do. So that is very nuanced and patient dependent and extremely, extremely rare. But there's, it comes up.
Yeah, I'm glad you said those things, and I totally agree. It's really tricky because, and I'm kind of curious, this is a little bit in the weeds with immune mediated disease, but are anytime we have a patient that we're suspicious has like immune-mediated thrombocytopenia or immune-mediated hemolytic anemia, we're always asking like, okay, like what was the trigger for this? And the majority of the time we just don't know. But we're trying to pinpoint something if we can, so that we can like focus on avoiding that in the future. And we always ask about vaccines, and it's just so hard because like, even if a dog had been like vaccinated a couple of weeks ago, like there could have been some sort of delayed thing, or like it's just hard to say for sure. So I always ask like in those cases, and I presume you might as well, but if they've had vaccines before to stimulate that immune response, and then maybe something happens that causes an aberrant immune mediated reaction, it's tricky. And I think the short version is that we still don't know a lot. And it kind of is one of those things that hopefully we'll figure out and be able to give a more nuanced answer. Like, yeah, definitely in this condition, we do or do not give vaccines because of XYZ. But right now there's just a lot of unknowns.
Yeah. And the last thing I would mention about that is there's also vaccines are so highly regulated that we're not trying to do a lot as far as like, here's a study where two groups of patients, like a blinded study, where one patient's getting vaccines and one is not, and then you do like a crossover and look for reactions. The companies that are making them are trying to put products on the market that are not causing reactions, and then when they get reported, that lot number, which shout out to people who report them because that's really, really important, but they try to remove that lot number and get rid of what's causing the problem, which is good, but does also make it hard to be scientific. And so that's just, I think, the nature of adverse reactions. Chris and Adam, are there scenarios where you prefer to not give vaccines, or when would you kind of say, I know you kind of touched on it a little bit and nuances with older patients, but do you have any hard no's for certain scenarios or certain patients where you're like, this patient really does not need vaccines, and where you might even mention it before the owner brings it up?
This is Chris. So the big thing for me, I mean, if we diagnosed hemangiosarc or some type of cancer, then we'd be like, yeah, we're not going to do any more if they're due for the vaccines. Like, I don't do it for those typically. And I'm iffy with, like, we have some IMHA dogs we're managing. That one, we just kind of just do the rabies and don't really do anything else because we're just kind of nervous with everything. And she's had some lapses. So it's very iffy. But yeah, the big thing is cancers for me and quality of life and like heart disease and things like that.
Yeah. And I would say same thing. Like if we're advanced stage end of life care, that Bordetella vaccine probably isn't worth it. If our kidney values are off the chart and we're barely eating and we're kind of managing end of life and palliative care, again, we can probably skip some of those vaccines, benefit versus risk versus reward kind of situation. And again, that like you guys have touched on, the IMHA and the extremely rare cases where a vaccine may have caused a severe adverse reaction, I typically try to defer those to the specialist and let them kind of work that up and make that call. If the owner is open to it, obviously. But again, that gets tricky. And again, those are extremely rare situations, but that's where, again, you just kind of have that open communication with the owner and decide what's going to be the best for the patient. And that very much is risk versus reward. And then again, the biggest one is that rabies vaccine, because again, it is technically required by law, but on the flip side, if it's going to kill the patient, it's a tricky situation. So again, that's where that open conversation comes into play, and just kind of doing what's best for the patient, decided upon by the veterinarian and the client together.
Yeah, I completely agree with those things. And I'll add in probably a very obvious one, which is if the patient comes in and they have a fever, or if they're obviously sick, that's one where it might be a good day to say, oh, you know what, maybe not today, but let's get you in. Let's reschedule that for like 2 weeks out or however far. Do y'all have a time period for that? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, typically, if they come in, that's a good point. If they come in with an illness, sometimes we'll get those where it's like vomiting, diarrhea, not doing right, and vaccines. Yeah. And they're like, well, hold on now.
We get those a lot.
Let's see what's going on first. And you do your exam, their temperature's 104 and they're lethargic and not eating and vomiting and diarrhea. It's like, maybe we shouldn't give these vaccines today. And most of the time you tell the owners that and they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. We'll wait. And then a lot of times, just like you said, let's do our diagnostics, do our treatment. Let's recheck in a couple of weeks. You come in a couple of weeks, temperature's normal, dog's wagging its tail, happy, eating, no more vomiting, diarrhea. Okay, now it's time. We can go ahead and vaccinate. So usually I'll do about a 2-week recheck, kind of see where they're at. And if they're clinically improved, clinically normal at that time, we can go ahead and vaccinate.
Yeah, this is Chris, the same. I mean, Adam just described like every case that comes in is like vomiting, diarrhea, and needs his vaccines. At least our receptionists now know it's like vaccines if well, because now they're like, okay, yeah, they're sick, so they're probably not going to get it. But yeah, same with Adam, 2 weeks ish. It just depends on the owner and their schedule. That's pretty much the gist of it.
Yeah, this is Jeff, and I'd say no notes. I think that's extremely reasonable. And imagine, just a little communication goes a long way because sometimes you don't know. So my last on-topic question I had for y'all before we hit the fun question, and likely an easy layup, I'll just say that. But as far as we're aware of, and I think I've mentioned it maybe at some point in the past when we were talking about how occasionally some of us have done vaccine clinics, and sometimes we do like a pop-up vaccine clinics within a pet food store or where have you. I've noticed when I'm working that some of those facilities sometimes will actually sell vaccines on their shelves. So my question is, thoughts?
This is Adam. So I've seen before, certain places will sell vaccines for the owner to purchase and administer. The biggest thing I can say to that, those may be effective. The biggest thing I tell people is that I can't speak to the efficacy of that. The product that I carry in the clinic that I'm administering, I stand behind. I stand behind the manufacturer. I stand behind the transport process. I stand behind my technicians who drew it up and that they drew it up appropriately and it was stored appropriately, both, again, on the shipment over and here in the clinic in the fridge, that it's labeled appropriately. Everything has been handled appropriately with that vaccination. And I stand by that. If it's vaccinated, used in as a vaccine within the clinic I'm working. That can't be said for a product on the shelf in a store. Again, I don't know. Maybe it was handled appropriately. Maybe it was manufactured okay, but I just can't speak to that efficacy. Maybe it was manufactured fine, but when they shipped it, it wasn't iced, and it needed to be chilled, and it lost its efficacy because it wasn't temperature controlled. I don't know. So again, it's one of those things, and really goes to almost anything that anybody asks me, any kind of supplements, the vaccines that they get over the counter, treats or whatever, anything that they show me on their phone that they bought on Amazon or whatever, it's like, yeah, that might be effective, but I personally can't speak to the efficacy of that. Because again, it's not something that I've put my own research into. It's not something I stand behind. Anything that's sold in this clinic, I stand behind. Anything outside this clinic, again, it's tough for me to kind of put my stamp of approval on that. Some obvious caveats to that, but again, those vaccines, I'm definitely a little leery of those.
Yeah, 100% agree, Adam. This is Jeff again, and ask a follow-up, which again, anybody can answer, but because this has actually happened to me in those scenarios where you've had a client who has vaccinated on their own and come to you for follow-up, like a puppy who's, when do you, or how do you go about, do you revaccinate, and how do you go about revaccinating if you do?
This is Chris. I typically revaccinate, or it's like the breeders' vaccines, and they just got it from whatever store on the shelf or whatnot. If they just got it, like let's say they got the puppy, it's like on Monday and I'm seeing them on Wednesday, I don't typically vaccinate right then and there. I'll typically say, let's redo it in a week or two and then vaccinate again. But I don't count those vaccines because I don't know, again, how are they handled? Do they leave them outside of the fridge? Did they give them in the right spot? Like, I don't know how they gave it. Did they go through the skin and actually get, like, there's just so many variables with it. So I always typically go with that those vaccines didn't count for me. But then we'll just give boosters as appropriate, or I treat it like, hey, it's a puppy. They had breeder vaccines or they did their own vaccines and they want to give it our vaccines now. Then I'll wait. I'll treat them almost like an older dog, depending on like what age we see them at too. It kind of just, there's not a cookie cutter answer. It's more just kind of play it by ear and see how it goes from there.
This is Brandon. Back when I was giving vaccines as a GP, I generally just didn't trust that they were given appropriately, just broadly. Because, you know, if you do, and maybe they were great, if not, I could come back and bite you. And then I feel like, and you guys can add in on this too, but like, I feel like half the time they were given it like 4 or 8 or 6 weeks of age. And ideally they're being given like 8, 12, 16 weeks. So at that point it's like, oh, did like this even really count if, you know, mom's immunity is still running through their system? So generally speaking, I just didn't trust it. And I just still followed the guidelines for 8, 12, 16 weeks, and making sure they at least get a booster for each of them, accordingly. And then, just the other thing to add about like people buying vaccines over the counter, if you give any of those, you're going to be at risk of your dog having a vaccine reaction. And like, then you're stuck at home with the pet with a vaccine reaction, not able to give the things that we would give. You know, we talk about giving Benadryl or diphenhydramine, but we're usually giving that as an injection, not just oral. So, that's just something to consider for owners that are kind of skeptical, or anyone that's an owner that's listening to this is like, I just do it at home. Like ideally, you know, we do it in the clinic for a reason. It's because if they have a reaction, we can act immediately.
Yeah, and I really don't have much to add. I would say it's a good thing to remember that in general, vaccines are quite literally a veterinary procedure, even though it seems minor, and it is more than worth your money to get it done by a licensed veterinarian, because that is the legal way to do it. And it's because you're also relying on our expertise to also take a look at the patient, examine them, check vitals, make sure it's appropriate to give them, and also give you a heads up when maybe something you miss. Honestly, just because if you happen to not be a veterinarian, hopefully there's something we'll catch if it doesn't make sense to give your particular pet a vaccine at this time. And even me, since I work in dermatology all day, I'm also not as up to date on vaccines. So I will often lean on Adam and Chris here and text them like, is now the right time, or what's most up to date right now with certain vaccines, or what's changed is really important to know that everybody may not have 100% access to. There are some good resources that we mentioned in our last pod, and we'll put in the show notes, but it is absolutely worth it to get it done by a veterinarian. Even we've talked about the vaccine clinics, even the pop-up ones are still licensed veterinarians and are appropriate to have vaccines administered from, or in a brick and mortar vet clinic is just the way to go. So without further ado, since I literally asked an extra question on topic and lied by adding an extra, let's go right to the end here with our fun question to end things out. And I will ask basically the question, from Brandon, which is, what is your favorite thing to do in the winter? Do you like winter? What's your favorite winter hobby? I'm going to tell you right now, I don't like winter. I hate the cold. But y'all go.
Well, this is Brandon. As of this recording, Colorado got a couple of feet of snow, depending on where you live. We did not get the pleasure of multiple feet of snow where I live. We got some inches, and they're already gone. But snowboarding, it's just the best thing ever. To be even more nuanced, splitboarding, which is where you have a snowboard that can split in two, and you put the pieces on each foot. You put what's called skins on the bottom of the two pieces, which have like a kind of a one-way grip. And you can go uphill in the backcountry or inbounds in resorts that allow it. And when you get to the top, you put the board back together and you ride down. It is one of my favorite ways to get a workout in, because you are burning through calories going uphill. By the time you're like 10 minutes in, even though you're all bundled up in multiple layers, you're like, you want to just strip everything off because you're just burning up. You get to the top and it's just a blast, especially in the backcountry. But always be careful in the backcountry. Wear your avalanche beacon if you are out there. Get training. But aside from that,
oh my God,
lots of fun. Lots of fun.
Aside from the natural disaster,
literally my favorite thing to do is splitboarding. It is so fun.
All right, what about y'all, Adam and Chris?
Well, yeah, I feel like anything I say is going to sound lame now after that answer. Well, yeah. I was going to say, like, going outside and playing in the snow with the kids is nice, but then getting to come in and shedding the layers and warming up and having a nice hot drink is nice. But also just like cuddling up by the fireplace, reading a book, that's the kind of thing I like to do in the winter. So keeping it simple.
There's nothing wrong with that.
This is Chris. I mean, yeah, I don't have anything as cool as splitboarding or snowboarding. We do like to snow tube if we can, get up to the mountains and do that. And I like to ski. I'm not good at it. I've probably skied 5 times in my life, so not that many. But yeah, I like to do that. I mean, if it's warm enough, when we go somewhere warm enough, I go fishing.
You can go ice fishing.
There you go.
And yeah, isn't that where they did the little circle in the ice, like cartoon style?
I said warm enough.
There's a reason that I do active sports in the winter, because if you're just standing around not doing a whole lot, you are going to be not happy.
Yeah. This is Jeff, and my favorite winter sport is to be completely inside, drinking something warm and praying for spring to return, and just chanting and shaking, it's only going to be 3 months. It's only going to be 3 months, over and over again. One of my life goals is to make enough money so I can be a snowbird and literally just avoid winter.
In Iowa, it was, instead of cuddling up by a warm fire, you just drink inside, and then you say, it's only going to be 8 months. It's only going to be 8 months.
Jesus.
Thank you once again for joining us on the Dogtor Bros.
If you would like to support us, please share this episode with others who may be interested in today's topic, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Would you like to influence our next episode? We love hearing your opinions and thoughts. Your comments may be our next topic.
Please leave us suggestions via email at thedoctorbros@gmail.com, DM us at thedoctorbros on Instagram, or leave us comments on our posts. Again, this is Brandon. You can reach me at Dr. Mason IM on Instagram.
And this is Chris, and you can reach me on Instagram at dr.chrishernandez.
And this is Jeff. You can find me on TikTok or Instagram at DermDrJeff, DermDogtorJeff.
And this is Adam. You can reach me on Instagram at DrAdamDVM. That's DrAdamDVM.